How did you come to be a journalist covering conflict? There are easier ways to earn money. It can't be easy for family life and just, just sanity, I guess, being exposed to so much trauma all the time. Tell us your journey into that.
So basically, I never set out to be a war correspondent. I don't like war. I wish wars would end. But what happened was really the result of an unexpected invitation to a wedding. And when I left university, I always wanted to write, but I didn't really know anything about journalism. I'd never met a journalist, and growing up, my parents read the Daily Mail, and more for kind of the sports and things than the news coverage. And then at university, a friend persuaded me to go to a cheese and wine party, if you can remember that. That's very kind of 70s or 80s. And being a student without any money, the idea of free cheese and wine was very appealing. So I went to this party, and it was for the university newspaper. So people there were talking about what they did. And I thought, actually, I really like writing, and I'm really curious about things. My mom would say I'm nosy. And so I decided to join, and I ended up editing that paper. So when I left university, I applied to the Financial Times to work as an intern, and just for the summer. And while I was there, the foreign editor was supposed to go to a lunch of South Asian politicians, and last minute he couldn't go. So he said to me, "You're always going on about India," because I had traveled a bit in India as a student and I loved it. So he said, "Why don't you go?" So I went to this lunch, and they were expecting the foreign editor of the Financial Times. They got the intern, but they were very nice. And I sat next to somebody who was Secretary General of the Pakistan People's Party. Now, at that time, Pakistan was a military dictatorship under General Zia. And the main opposition party, the PPP, the leader of that was Benazir Bhutto, and she was living here in exile. So this man asked me if I'd like to interview her. Of course, I said yes. And she was living in the Barbican at the time. I went to interview her, and the day that I interviewed her was the day that she announced her engagement to Asif Ali Zardari. So her flat was absolutely full of bouquets of flowers. I've never seen so many. And so that sort of also gave me a peg for my interview. Anyway, she then went back to Pakistan. I got a job at Central TV in Birmingham. One day I came home from work, maybe 6 months after that, and on my doormat was the most beautiful gold inscribed invitation I had ever seen, and it was to her wedding in Karachi. I'd never been to Pakistan. It was an incredible introduction. Any of you who have been to South Asian weddings, maybe have had a South Asian wedding, will know that they go on for a long time. They're very big, they're very colorful. Benazir, being who she was, to me, I'd never seen anything like it. It was like something out of Arabian Nights, and I was completely captivated. But also she invited me not just to the sort of ceremonial events, but also to these gatherings in her house every night with her political colleagues, which were to discuss how to try and topple the dictator. And so I was meeting all these people. So I was 21. I was meeting people not much older than me who were telling me about being tear gassed or imprisoned or tortured just to try and bring democracy to their country, which I had always taken for granted. So I was fascinated. So I came back and thought, I'm not going to work in local news in Birmingham anymore. So I gave in my notice. The last story I ever did for Central TV was a man who turned his car back to front, so it looked like it was going forwards when it was going backwards. I don't think it was a great loss to TV. And I went off to live in Pakistan. But I talked to foreign editors here about freelancing for them, and nobody was interested in Pakistan. They all said to me, General Zia's been there 11 and a half years, nothing's going to change. And they didn't listen to me about Benazir going back and that she was starting this movement. So they said to me, we are, however, interested in Afghanistan, because at that time it was under Soviet occupation. And this was the sort of last war of the Cold War, and it was being seen very much as a sort of brave Afghan Mujahideens against these Russian soldiers. So they said to me, we would be interested if you covered that. So for that reason, I went to live in Peshawar on the border with Afghanistan and started traveling in and out of Afghanistan with the Afghan Mujahideen, and just completely fell in love with it. I became very passionate about the country. And really at the beginning, I thought I was just going to do this being a foreign correspondent for a short time to kind of make a little bit of money and get some stories. And then I was going to go and rent sort of garret somewhere and write my great novel. But then Afghans are amazing storytellers. It's an incredible oral tradition. And right from early on, when I met lots of tribal elders from southern Afghanistan, and they were telling me these incredible stories, and I just thought, I can't make up stories like this. So actually, I want to tell these stories. So I have never written a novel. I've written lots of books, but they've always been other people's stories that I have gathered, and mostly conflicts, because unfortunately there are lots of wars going on. So
Wow.
sorry, that's a long story, but that is...
It's fascinating. I can't imagine you as a 21-year-old meeting Benazir Bhutto. Incredible. We have friends here tonight from Afghanistan, and I don't know, as someone who's just watching from afar, I can't see how the future works out. I can't see, after all the trillions of dollars of military intervention, and now we're back to square one, it seems. As someone with a long history with Afghanistan, do you have any view of how you think things will progress there?
I find it heartbreaking. I mean, I've gone back and forth for all those years, and to see everything from the last 20 years just be lost almost overnight, to meet Afghan women and girls that I know who have had everything taken away from them. Afghanistan, as you know, is the only country on earth where girls cannot go to high school or university. It will soon be 2 years that that's the case. And yes, everybody outside has expressed outrage about this, but nobody's actually doing anything about it. I almost feel like now it's sort of accepted outside that that is the situation. And it's just so horrible. I mean, the number of Afghan girls and women who I know who have said to me things like, it would have been better if you, the West, had never come here because you created dreams that now are shattered. And it is a really, really grim situation. I've been 3 times back since the Taliban took over, and I still just can't get my head around it, really. I can't think of another. I've covered lots of terrible things around the world, but nothing has traumatized me the way that. Because I also feel, did we do something wrong as journalists that we didn't? I mean, I wrote a whole book called Farewell Kabul, which is quite a big book, which came out a couple of years before the Taliban took over, which was looking at all the mistakes that had been made. But honest to God, I didn't think the Taliban were going to just completely take over like that. And it is extremely depressing. So, yeah, I mean, at the moment, it's hard to be very optimistic about anything there. Not least because you just don't see who the alternative is. They don't see many good guys in this situation. I mean, the previous government just fled, right? They jumped in helicopters and left. It's very different to Ukraine in that way. I mean, had Zelensky done that when the Russians came and said, all right, they're coming for us and let's take the American lift and go, I think it would be a very different situation. But he stayed and made a point of making those videos, showing that they were there. And that did not happen in Afghanistan. So I think the last government has a lot to answer for. I mean, there are many other people to blame, and how the West did the withdrawal and lots of mistakes that were made. But that, really didn't help. But I think it's fair to say we're not very good at focusing on more than one thing at a time, either as media or as politicians. And so when Russia invaded Ukraine last year, that really took up all the bandwidth, right? And so most of the restrictions that the Taliban have imposed came after that happened, because nobody was watching anymore what was happening in Afghanistan.
I'd like to ask you a question about journalism, because I've seen how really powerful journalism builds empathy. Suddenly, somewhere far away becomes really important to us. And I'm still someone that wants to celebrate the good that has happened by so many people being aware of the situation in Ukraine. Many people here will be hosts, actually, that have never worked with refugees before, but somehow reporting like yours and others opened people's eyes to fellow human beings that needed our help. And then suddenly 175,000 Ukrainians are being hosted in our homes. It's incredible. We've never done anything like it before. So I can see how journalism can build that empathy bridge. But there are other parts of the world, as you say, that are not getting the same attention. We mentioned Sudan. We could say the same about Eritrea, even Afghanistan today. How does it work? Because I'm sure there are stories you want to tell that might not get published because some editor doesn't think it's going to get the airtime or the clicks. How do you wrestle with that?
I'm very conscious of this problem, and so I try and still cover other places. I went, for example, Zimbabwe, which is a country that is experiencing a lot of violence, political violence, and I went and did a trip there to remind people of what was happening there. I went to Syria last autumn, so I do try and go, but the fact is, we have this major war in Europe, and I think it's also very important that we don't stop covering it.
No,
right?
right.
So, and I know there is a concern that people will start to lose interest. So I think it's very important that we do keep going and covering it, but we don't have that many resources. So it is a difficult balance, I think.
Yeah. Talk us through some of the books you've written. We're at a literary festival, so good opportunity for you to talk about them. My wife read your most recent one, which is about you staying in a hotel that lots of homeless people have been welcomed in. That seemed to be a real eye-opener. But for those interested in Afghanistan, maybe you could share some of the writing you've done there.
So I've written 10 books. 2 of them are on Afghanistan, Sewing Circles of Herat and Farewell Kabul. Sewing Circles of Herat is kind of about my love affair with Afghanistan, and I wrote that back in 2002 because I was very concerned after 9/11, when there was so much focus on Afghanistan and lots of reporting. But the kind of impression that people seem to be getting back here was very much of this country of men with beards and guns and not much else, and dusty landscapes. And I knew a different Afghanistan with beautiful mountains and lakes and poetry and flowers, and so I wanted to convey that in that book. So that's so it's about going back to Afghanistan after the Taliban had gone. And finding different groups of people and writing about what happened to them. And then probably the best known book I have done is a book with Malala. I Am Malala. I co-wrote her book, which was a wonderful experience to work with her. I also wrote a book with a Syrian refugee called Najin, called The Girl from Aleppo. And she is the most remarkable person. I mean, people often say to me, how can you do what you do? Isn't it depressing that you go to all these bad places and meet evil people? But I always say to them, but in those places you meet remarkable people. Malala is a good example, but also Najin. I met her during the refugee crisis in 2015, when we were all crossing Europe and reporting on the refugees in different places, and you'll probably remember that some countries hosted people much better than others, and the worst place of all, in my view, was Hungary, where the government built a huge fence to stop people crossing in. And so the day that that fence was finished, I was on the border with other journalists, and then somebody said that on the other side of the border in Serbia was a Syrian refugee in a wheelchair who spoke fluent English and wants to be an astronaut. And that's like journalistic gold, right? So I didn't meet her then. I met her later on, and this was Najine. And I mean, some of you here, if you host refugees, maybe you are refugees, will know how very, very difficult it is to be a refugee, to leave everything you've ever known, going into places where no one wants you much of the time. And so that's really hard for able-bodied people. But then imagine if you're in a wheelchair. And I couldn't really conceive of how this girl, she was 16, and her sister, Nisreen, who's the real hero actually, had pushed her across all the way from Syria, and they'd taken the dinghy from Turkey across to Lesbos, and with very high waves, and when they were on the boat, other people, it was very overcrowded, and other people in the dinghy were saying, we must throw this wheelchair over because it's going to puncture the dinghy. And I mean, they'd had really tough time, and yet she had this huge smile on her face. And she's one of these people that if you spend an hour with her, you just feel better about life. She just has a real gift for that. And she had never been to school because she couldn't walk, and they lived on a 5th floor apartment, and there was no elevator. So the only way to get her up and down was for her brothers to carry her all the way. So she never went to school. And yet, she spoke fluent, really fluent English. I was the first English person that she'd conversed with, and yet she spoke. Amazing. I couldn't believe it. And she taught herself English from watching an American soap opera called Days of Our Lives. And so she just used to watch TV endlessly in this apartment, and she used to watch the History Channel, so she could list. When she came to England, she was so excited because she listed all the kings and queens of England, which I can't do. And she knew about string theory, but she didn't know basic addition. She'd never done things like, 2 + 2. So it was very strange. She had this incredible intellect on one hand, but also hadn't got basic schooling. Anyway, they did make their way to Germany, and they live there now, and her mother was able to come and join them, which is great. And so that was actually a sort of happy ending of a refugee story. And then my most recent book, last but one book is most important book to me, which is a book about sexual violence in conflict. And I wrote that book because I was so angry at what was happening. Because there really is, as we sit here today, there is an epidemic of sexual violence around the world, everywhere from the Democratic Republic of Congo and South Sudan was Sudan, now we're seeing it, and Afghanistan, Eritrea, Ukraine, and then in the detention centers of protesters in Iran, in Belarus, Uyghurs in China. I mean, you name it, we'd be here all day if I start. And really that book, I wrote about 12 countries in that book, but I could have spent the rest of my life, sadly, writing that book. I think it is absolutely outrageous that this is a war crime and nobody does anything about it. Accountability is the exception, not the rule. Almost nobody is prosecuted. So that was a real kind of labor of love. And then my most recent book is the only book I've ever done on my own country, and that's a book called The Prince Rupert Hotel for the Homeless. And of course, during COVID, I couldn't travel as a foreign correspondent, so I ended up writing about my own country for the first time. And I was very interested in how COVID affected people differently, that the inequalities in our society were exposed and exacerbated by the pandemic, and how lockdown was very different for somebody living in a cramped flat in a tower block in Tower Hamlets to me in my house with a little garden and a few bedrooms. And so I really focused on that and the human cost. And one of the things I thought about was what happens to all the homeless people. And the government actually had really a successful program called Everyone In, which was to get all the rough sleepers off the street by the weekend of the first week. And they did it. And what they did was use hotels, because the hotels had no guests, because people couldn't travel. And so I wrote about it in London, and it was mostly here, it was like bed and breakfasts and budget hotels. But then I heard about this hotel in a place called Shrewsbury, and called the Prince Rupert Hotel. And I first heard about it because I was on a Zoom call with the manager of the hotel, a really remarkable woman called Charlie Green. And she told me that their hotel had taken in, I think at that time it was about 35 homeless people, and that she and the owner of the hotel and the accountant had all left their own homes and moved into the hotel to look after the homeless people. So I was fascinated by this. So I went to go and meet them and do an interview. And actually, this hotel was very different to the hotels I'd come across before doing this. This is the most luxurious hotel in Shrewsbury. It's a 4-star hotel with 4-poster beds and chandeliers and a decanter of sherry at the reception and knights in armor. And it's very historic. It's parts of it 900 years old. It's called Prince Rupert Hotel because Prince Rupert himself lived there for a while during the Civil War. So I thought this is so interesting that some of the people who moved in there had lived on the streets for decades, and suddenly they're living in this hotel in this luxury. And how would this all work? So I asked them if I could actually move into the hotel as well. And so I stayed there for some time, and it was, for me, it was a really interesting way of being able to understand a bit more about homelessness, because I was suddenly living with people who'd been homeless for years. And had I written a book about that normally, I suppose I would have gone to a shelter or stayed out on the streets here for a while. But it would have been much more superficial, whereas here I was living with them. It was locked down, so they couldn't escape me. And some people didn't want to talk because they were very wary because of the way that they'd been treated. But other people, really were delighted to have somebody to speak to. So and that hotel ended up taking in more than 100 homeless people. When hotels reopen, you might remember that. So first lockdown started in March, and bit by bit things reopened. Hotels were the last thing to reopen, which was in July. But actually this hotel, they were so worried about the idea of what would happen to their homeless guests that they didn't reopen. They stayed with the homeless people. And finally, in September, they reopened, because by then they only had about 25 homeless, but they had those people staying there as well as the paying guests, which was also very interesting. One of the homeless, funny woman called Bev, delighted in kind of giving wrong tourist information to the people staying there. And some of the other homeless felt annoyed that because they were used to having complete attention from the staff, and suddenly there were these paying guests, so they felt they weren't being treated as well. So they started posting sort of angry reviews on TripAdvisor. So anyway, it was a very interesting experience.
Amazing. Wow. You've written so many helpful books, and I'm trying to join the dots between the global picture that you get of, geopolitics and all the terrible things happening with gender-based violence, and yet still finding hope in those individuals that you've drawn close to. And I think some of us here can relate a little bit to that we feel very powerless when we look at, what Russia's doing in Ukraine or what's happening in Sudan or the terrible things in Eritrea, and thinking, you know what, I might not be able to fix all that, but I could help one person that needs somewhere to live here, or someone that needs mentoring, or someone that needs a door opening. And so I think your books help us join those two worlds
I
together.
absolutely feel that. I mean, that's something like Malala says, one girl, one pen, one book, one teacher can change the world. And I really, it's very easy to despair and think the problems are so big we can't do anything. But actually, we can all do a small thing. And even like with the homeless, just to stop and speak to somebody and smile at them. And what was most interesting to me about doing that book was that the people who, at the end of that year, that they had those 100 homeless people who felt that they had most benefited were not the homeless, but the owner,
Wow.
the manager, and the accountant. And these were not, what was interesting too was there were not people that had natural empathy for, in fact, the owner had said to me he used to walk past homeless people in doorways and be annoyed, thinking, why don't these people get a job? And why are they littering the streets? And this completely changed his view. So they feel that they're the ones that really benefited from having
So
those
good.
guests.
So helpful. Many of us have seen that with our own experiences of drawing close to refugees. Suddenly, again, refugees are not problems, they're people that we can come alongside. So, Christina, thank you for not just this evening, but for the incredibly brave work you're doing, continuing to keep Ukraine on the public agenda, visiting Afghanistan, helping the world to care. We know it doesn't come without a cost, so thank you for all that you're doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you for what you do, Chris.